I'm going to turn to Rebecca and Willie in just a moment, but I'll share that in preparation for tonight, I dug up both of their honors theses, which are available in the Emory Library honors theses repository, and have refreshed my memory because I immediately remembered each case. Rebecca, you graduated first, but the amazing thing about your work was that you plugged in to an ongoing research initiative in Vietnam about nutrition and nutritional additives to particular sauces, right? Am I getting this right? That were used in Vietnam, and you came back with this, all this sort of hands-on experience from engaging in the research, and then compared it to nutritional practices here. It was a really interesting project, but especially the really fabulous experience you got by being able to go and plug in with the principal investigator in Vietnam. And then Willie, as I read yours, basically you did a sort of case study on Spain that we could apply right today to the dictator in Russia, right, attacking Ukraine, because you worked on the sort of lingering memories and effects of fascist dictatorship in Spain. You worked with Professor Lancaster on that. So it was a real pleasure to go back and look at the studies you actually did, and maybe some of the other students here tonight will have some questions about that. But I want to turn to introducing you beyond just kind of summarizing your work as undergrads. I think the best way to do this is maybe for me just to question each of you. Rebecca Altman, you don't need to state your name. We know that already, but what year did you graduate? What exactly was your major, and did you have a minor while you were here?
It's so nice to meet all of you and be here, and Willie to also meet you. So I graduated in 2010, which feels like a very long time ago, and also not a long time ago at all at the same time. I did major in interdisciplinary studies in culture and society. I had a focus on Asian studies and global health, and I minored in global health. I don't know if it's still called, I think it was global health, culture, and society. That was the name of that minor at the time.
Cool. Yeah. And where are you tonight?
Yes, well, daytime still here. It is 3 o'clock. I live in the Bay Area and based in the San Francisco area.
Excellent. Excellent. I'm going to turn to your current occupation in a second, but just turning to Willie Reeves. So what year did you graduate, Willie? And what was your major? And did you have any minors?
Yes, well, pleasure to be with everyone tonight. Thanks so much for having me. I think this is an awesome conversation. So I was the class of 2012. I was also an interdisciplinary studies major with a concentration in international human rights and a minor in ethics. And I am joining us from Boston, Massachusetts, where I recently moved to a few months ago for a new role in biotechnology.
Wow. Okay. And where did you move from?
Washington, D.C. I spent the last 7 years there after returning from 2 years in South Korea.
Yeah, interesting. So both Rebecca and Willie have had international experience. Going to turn to that possibly now. So I want to switch gears to your current kind of biographies. So I studied these a little bit, you guys. Willie, I gotta admit, it's really impressive, but I don't know what the heck you do. It says here you're the chief of staff at Celino, a cell therapy company on a mission to make personalized stem cell therapies available to patients at a large scale. You lead the company's staffing and expansion strategy, media and community engagement, and works closely with the CEO's office. It sounds like you just do everything the CEO tells you. Is that more or less correct?
It's not incorrect, Dr. Wakefield. Typically at a startup, they always say you wear many hats. Now that I'm 4 months into a startup, I'm not even someone who normally wears hats in real life, but I have loads of them in my job.
So tell us a little more. What sort of responsibilities or skills are you using every day in that job? Media, communication, organization, what sort of stuff? What did you do today, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a whole variety of things. And one thing that I especially appreciate about the role that I have now is that my company itself is also very multi and interdisciplinary. So we sit at the intersection of stem cell biology, laser physics, and all of these other areas, machine learning, engineering, software, and hardware. It's kind of a big combination of all of those. And so in a very funny way that I never in a million years could have planned, a lot of my previous experiences from the time that I was an IDS major in South Korea and DC, et cetera, have all contributed. So on the day-to-day, there are a lot of different things. So I am oftentimes in meetings with potential partner companies, let's say pharmaceutical companies that may want to use our platform. We're building a strategy around how to do that. I had several interviews with people because we're growing our team very quickly. So every candidate in the company touches me at least once. So I get to meet everyone. There's all sorts of things. I do a lot of writing in my role. Communication is extremely important, which is something that IDS was so key in helping me to develop that skill. So it's, never the same thing from day to day, but I appreciate that dynamic nature of my job.
Right. Interesting. Great answer. Thank you. You're already tying it into the themes about, how it related to your major. So turning to you, Rebecca, the beautiful thing about Rebecca's kind of page bio, you have this beautiful kind of headline. You're a self-awareness activator, proliferator of human potential, cooking creative. I love that one. Empathy enthusiast, and a Californiated Carolinian. I think I messed up that word about California, but so what exactly do you do, Rebecca?
That doesn't totally capture it. We're actually doing a whole branding effort, so our website is going to change soon. So I work at a social impact strategy firm called Third Plateau. I joined the team about 6 years ago now, when we were just 6 people, and now we're over 35. So I've definitely experienced a lot of growth. Willie, like you said, just that wearing every hat at the beginning, and now it's sort of the same. But my job is I'm vice president of the leadership development work that we do. So I oversee our line of business that actually works to grow and develop leaders. Our whole company is focused on social impact. So our clients are nonprofits, foundations, and all kinds of funders. And our work overall is to really build capacity in the social sector to carry out the projects that they're working on. So that can vary from working on strategic plans, business plans, helping nonprofits figure out how to fundraise, helping funders figure out where to give the funding that they have. So there's a lot of different components of our work. My focus is on the leaders, right? The actual people that lead these organizations, both on the funder side and on the nonprofit side. So part of what I really leaned on in the IDS background that I have is actually creating this work from scratch. We didn't used to have a leadership development line of our work. It's something that I built out of my own experiences, really realizing that, through, to your point, Dr. Wakefield, about my research in Vietnam, realizing how powerful it is to ask individuals questions and using the answers to actually inform change. And so that's really what I do. I'm an executive coach. The team I lead are executive coaches. We facilitate group team coaching. We do individual one-on-one leadership development coaching, 360 reviews, and other tools that help leaders actually reflect on how they're showing up, how they're leading, and how that work is actually driving social change. So that's a bit about what I do.
Really interesting. So you're working with nonprofits. So do they pay you for these services?
Our clients are nonprofits and funders. So we have, large major institutional foundations, smaller family foundations, and nonprofits that are actually hiring us to help on these key strategic questions.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Thanks. Great answers. Here's a question for both of you. I think it'll be interesting for the people in the audience to hear a little bit about one thing let me frame it this way. One thing that was interesting to me that you two were selected for whatever reasons, you're available and all of that, but really interesting is that you both had international professional experiences since you graduated Emory. Could you talk about those a little bit, Rebecca, and then I'll turn to you, Willie.
Sure. Yeah, I've always had that international orientation, and I definitely experienced so much profound change from studying abroad during my time at Emory. I, out of college, worked on a very small nonprofit startup that's now quite large, but I was in Brazil right out of college, kind of like on an internship, post 2008 recession. It was difficult to find jobs. So I was kind of interning with this founder of this tiny startup. But I was in Brazil for several months, and at that time was able to actually secure the job that I took at Ashoka, which is the largest global network of social entrepreneurs. So Willie, I was also in DC for several years. And that time there, really, I continued to have that international orientation and really eager to kind of experience Ashoka's work in a global context. It's a primarily global organization, other than the headquarters here. So I moved to Sweden and helped to launch Ashoka in Scandinavia, so covering Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. So I definitely have always had that international orientation. Interestingly, the last few years has been very much more focused domestically on social change efforts. But that time in Sweden, I was 24 years old and helping to launch this organization. I mean, I don't know if I didn't know what I was doing, but I definitely had the mindset that I would figure it out and had support around me. So the international experience has definitely been significant, both in my educational background and the way that I look at the work that I do. I think being abroad in any shape or form can change how you think about yourself and can change how you think about what you're trying to do in the world. So that change in perspective is, I think, essential as we're all growing and changing.
Yeah, well, very well said there. Willie, would you agree with that? And tell us a little bit about your international experience.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more with what Rebecca said. I think the more, especially that you engage in international experiences, particularly deeper and or longer ones, the more opportunity that there is for change in a good way. So I too studied abroad. The summer after my sophomore year at Emory, I studied abroad in Spain. I went abroad a second time to do a fellowship in Argentina with sustainable development. So I ended up teaching English, doing grant writing for a local nonprofit on the ground there, and among other things. And then after Emory, spent 2 years in South Korea teaching English as my primary job, and then was invited by the Korean government to start doing project management for them on educational projects. And then in my spare time or whatever, during the evenings, I co-founded and ran with some friends actually who were there, a North Korean human rights NGO. So there were so many different pieces. And then it was funny because once I repatriated and came back to the States, I ended up doing lots of international work. So my portfolio, my previous company was the world's largest biotechnology trade association. So we worked with biotech companies, pharmaceutical companies, et cetera, kind of the life sciences sphere all around the world. And my portfolio was, across the US, plus Sweden, Brazil, Taiwan, Japan, France. So I ended up spending 40 to 50% of my year at home in DC and 40 to 50% of my year out and about, out in the world. So it was funny. And it kind of became a joke at my company whenever we were exploring a new country or a new opportunity. Executive team was like, "Oh, send Willie. He'll figure it out. He probably speaks that language." So I think all of these experiences tied together really nicely and were just tremendously valuable. But I really agree. The ways that you are pushed to grow and the sorts of experiences that you'll encounter when you're living abroad, it will change. It will vary from country to country, but regardless of where it is, you will be pushed, you will grow, you will learn in ways that you didn't know possible before.
Yeah.
Something I'll just add to that, Willie, because I think there's a lot of value in everything you just said, but I think what you said that I really resonate with is the idea of staying abroad longer, like doing more than a couple of months abroad. I mean, we were in Sweden for 3 years, and that time, you figure out how to pay taxes in another country, you figure out all these things that are really challenging at first, and have you look in the mirror and figure out how to solve these kinds of challenges, and you somehow figure it out. And I think there's a lot of learning that comes from those kinds of experiences that really shake up your everyday, like paying taxes.
Absolutely. Yes. Foreign taxation.
Yeah.
How about languages? So, Rebecca, you learned Swedish?
I learned some Swedish. I'm not very good at languages. It sounds like I needed Willie's language skills. In Sweden, my work was in English because I was working for an American nonprofit. We were working across Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. I was traveling between. And when you're working across those 3 Scandinavian countries, they speak English with each other because they all speak different languages. So I was able to actually do all of my work in English. I did study some Swedish, but people's English is almost better than mine. So we resorted to that. Yeah.
And Willie, what languages do you have?
So Spanish was my second growing up. And then later I learned Brazilian Portuguese while I was at Emory, actually. And that came years later to serve me well in my work in Brazil. And then I used to speak Korean reasonably well. It has atrophied over the past 8 years being back in the States, but I can still like switch it on in certain situations, like going to Korean restaurants.
Ah, good for you. Good for you. I'm going to transition to some of the questions that were suggested by Sophia and her staff there. So the first question is, basically, how did you decide upon your major? But I would amplify just a little bit because I'm seeing Davia and Julian and Coco Chu and Jacqueline Lin here, all students currently. We've had a discussion actually just this week. We were reading some bell hooks, talking about authenticity in the choice of one's course of study, and this question of passion versus practicality, and how much are your educational choices shaped by sort of a market driven approach as opposed to something that's more authentic, whatever that might mean. So I mean, basically, looking back, what were some of the most important courses and reasons why you chose the major that you did? Rebecca, you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. I think that there are, when I think about that question, I don't know if there's any one class that actually I would call out per se, but actually it was more about the eclectic nature of the classes I took, which I think if you're in the ILA, you understand, that concept of the importance of being interdisciplinary. So I wouldn't say there's any one class. I mean, I was able to take a class at Rollins that was really amazing and really challenging. Taking, classes across the university. I think that was really, I think it instilled in me a resourcefulness that I still call on. Like now, as I'm building this leadership development work and actually, building things from scratch, it's the same concept of actually figuring out different routes that you can take to get to an end goal. So I don't know if it's any one course, but I do definitely think the eclectic nature of the courses helped shape the way that I solve problems now, the way that I look at change. I think I've always been sort of different in the way that I think, in the way that I never fit into a major. And that was where I sort of landed at Dr. Wakefield's door. Like, can I do this? Because I was trying to fit into a different major my freshman year and it just wasn't quite right for me. And so landing at the ILA's door and Dr. Wakefield's door was just essential for me to realize, oh, I can actually bring my best self here, which has always been a multidisciplinary approach to the way that I see the world. So I think that's really what led me to this major, was just my own way of thinking and my own perspective on the world, which is there's not one way to solve a problem, but it's really about the intersectionality of different ideas and concepts and theories. So that's how I landed there. And I don't know if I have one class in particular. It's more about
that's okay. I like what you say about being able to bring your best self forward. That's really nice. And Willie, what's your story on this matter?
Yeah, so it's funny because one of the reasons that I was really interested in Emory is because I had sought out the interdisciplinary studies program, and I had been interested in Emory for a while. And then I found out about IDS. So quite early in my freshman year, I began haranguing Dr. Wakefield to let me become an IDS major. And, I loved the idea of creating a custom program. And I knew that there were all these different things that I was interested in. In high school, I had done a variety of different summer internships and fellowships. I did a National Transportation Institute. I went to journalism school for a summer semester. I did an Academy of Applied Sciences fellowship working an NIH grant. So I was doing lab work in biotech. Like, there were all of these very different things. And each of the things that I just articulated, all of those had experiences that have been helpful with my current role and my previous one. But to your point, Dr. Wakefield, about kind of the market-driven approach, a lot of my friends were kind of taking the approach of, oh, well, I want to major in something that's practical, something that will directly translate to a job after I graduate. And that those are not incorrect thoughts, and I don't ding any of my friends for considering that. I sort of took a different approach, and I think everyone that's an IDS did, looking at the practicalities of what do I actually want to do? What am I interested in? And I was interested in loads of things. Business, law. I wanted to go to law school since I was 13. So to the point around what are your favorite classes? Several. International Human Rights with Dr. David Davis. That was awesome. Social Research Methods with Dr. Irene Brown in the social department. But actually, like Rebecca, what was perhaps most important for me was taking classes across the university. So I cross-enrolled at the business school for a semester. Yes, you can do that. As a student in the college, I took business law with Dr. Burdett. She's amazing. It's an amazing course, one of the most practical courses I ever took that I still use. Knowledge from that when working on contracts with my clients, etc. Going back to some of that early contract drafting experience, another one was as part of my honors thesis, I cross-enrolled at the law school for a semester and took a class there on Nuremberg law. And it was honestly one of the most fascinating things that I've ever done. And not only because Dr. Deborah Lipstadt is the world's most just renowned scholars on Nuremberg law and everything that happened around it.
That was before she was in the movie.
It was before the movie. Hearing everything live from her, we would come to class and she's like, yes, I got sued by this guy because he said the Holocaust didn't exist or didn't happen. And I called him out for it. So it was this intense experience. But through all of that, I learned, I think, so much. And I learned perhaps more at the intersections. Mm-hmm. And because of those unusual combinations of courses that I took. So I loved that experience. And honestly, if I had to redo Emory all over again and go back to 2008, I think I would pretty much repeat everything the way that I did it. I'd definitely be an IDS major again. And I would still have bothered Dr. Wakefield as a freshman and all of that.
I think I would too, Willie. The only difference that I will call out that maybe could be supportive to all of you is I would have given myself a little bit less of a hard time for not fitting into a major. I don't know if any of you feel this way, but I was definitely like, why am I different? What's different about the way that I think? And it's sort of critical of it when now I see that this is actually what's allowed me to pursue a career that is really aligned with my values. So I think the only difference I would take is to go back in time and just courageously dive into courses that feel exciting, that align with the intersection you're focused on, that give you things that, that light you up, right? Like finding things that light you up versus just being self-critical of the way that you're pursuing your studies. So that's the only thing I would add.
Yeah, if I can just quickly add to that point, I think it was funny because knowing that I wanted to be an IDS major, sort of going into Emory, sometimes I would talk to people and explain my major to them. And I even heard from a few faculty, obviously outside the ILA, IDS, one particular faculty member said, the I don't study major, which I was very offended by. But what I think was interesting about that was, to Rebecca's point, there is this perception around the things that you should do or the things that you should study and how you should do everything. I think people like Rebecca and all of you, every one of you on this call, you're open to exploring what is different and what is maybe unusual. And I would just encourage you to continue doing that, because it's precisely like, for example, my last job, the international bouncing around the world job, I started that as a contractor. I only got that job because I threw my resume up on Indeed.com one day completely randomly, and a recruiter found me, and they liked me because of my international experience, not because of, some of the doing anything in a straight line, but they liked that I'd done some work in Argentina. They liked the opportunities in South Korea and that I had lab experience. So it was only because I had the intersection of all of these very disparate looking pieces that I was able to find some of the opportunities that I did. And when I came back to the States, it was, in the very beginning, it was difficult to articulate what I wanted to do, because people looked at my resume and they were like, South Korea 2 years, refugees, teaching English, Argentina, like, what are you doing? What do you want to do with your life? And at one point I remember sitting down and saying, Willie, stop thinking about this as a series of jobs and think about it as the story. And once I thought about it that way, I just told people what my story is and thought of it as a mosaic. And there are different pieces and they're different colors and they're different shapes and sizes. And they were even in different countries. But all of those pieces came together and helped me get where I am now.
Yeah, and sorry, Dr. Wakefield, one thing to add to that, I don't want to throw off your question asking, but I think that thread, Willie, is, I feel very similar to that. I mean, I have this very striking memory of when I worked at Ashoka. I was in DC. I was in the elevator with the Swedish woman who was hired to launch Ashoka Scandinavia, and she needed a counterpart. And we just connected because she couldn't believe that I had been in Brazil, and the way I studied and the multidisciplinary approach, that it allowed me to actually take on a role that was far beyond my years at that time. But I think so. I do really think that there is professional value in having the ability at the age that you all are to see how topics intersect and explore what those intersections are. So I do think that that's hugely valuable. I also think that that curiosity is more important than anything else. Like the skill building that comes from a major that actually cuts across different disciplines, the skill building around curiosity, the skill building around actually being able to ask people good questions and solve problems. I think that those skills are way more practical and useful down the line than any facts or figures that you learn in a particular class. So that, at least for me, those skills are things that I use daily when I'm coaching clients and helping them like really figure out, how do I thread together my story? What is my story? These are the questions I deal with daily with my clients. So I directly find correlations back to the work in my IDS major.
Yeah, I mean, what you just said, that's the money quote there, Sophia. What Rebecca just said about, it's the skills and not the name on the degree, because they're going to have a highlight role of all of this. So just flagging that. But
furiously typing right now.
There you go. So Julian Dubeck is on this call. Hi, Julian. He's a senior. He's got a thick skin, and he knows that I call people out like this. I'm going to ask him because he's been thinking all through this question as he's revealed to me. Just wondering if you wanted to join, Julian, like what the things you've just heard and the thoughts you've had about, how to choose a major and how to focus yourself as a student at Emory. Do you have any questions or reflections you'd like to share? Where do you stand on all of this?
Yeah, well, I will say I took a gap semester last spring, and for a while I did like mortgage lending, working as like a loan processor, and then I did digital media for Northwestern Mutual. So like I completely understand the idea of like how it's not like a linear path. This summer I might do like I might work for like a secondhand like luxury e-commerce site in their sneakers department. So I'm totally on the wave of, things aren't linear, and I'm kind of just like living my life and whatever comes, with some intervention, obviously, but with whatever comes, I'm with it, and I embrace it as well.
But I thought from some of your comments that you also have felt pressure for a different path through your studies.
Yeah. So I'm in the business school. I major in operation and management. So of course there's, the business jobs out there. But yeah, I'm still looking, still keeping my options open.
Cool. And I'm looking at Erik Shu, who's in the back of the classroom on this photo. He's been looking for intellectual community. So Erik, I want to hear from you before this is all over. But let me ask one more question, and then we'll kind of open it up to everyone here. Well, let's see. I'm looking at some of the questions that Sophia nicely prepared. You've mentioned many of them. Maybe the simple but sort of wide open one. What do you wish you had known while you were an Emory student that you know now?
Rebecca, you want to hit that one first?
I can try. When I thought about this question before, my answer was very similar to what we've talked about, which is just, and I'll offer this metaphor, and then maybe after Willie talks, I'll think of anything else that comes up. But I wish I had known that your career is a lot more like a quilt than it is a straight line. And what I mean about a quilt, like if you think about the most beautiful quilts, there are lots of different squares with lots of different colors. The colors don't always match. The patterns don't always match. And each thing you do is sort of like another square on that quilt. I think that having a colorful and diversely, aesthetically pleasing quilt is way better than one that's all the same color and the same texture. And I wish I had known that. I think, like I mentioned, I did put a lot of pressure on myself to have it all figured out and have that perfect job coming out of college and have everything sorted. And I didn't. And it led me to things that were the perfect job for me at that time that allowed me to get to a point where now I feel like I really am in the career that is the best use of my skills. And having, these years of experience behind me gives me a lot of space to create and have autonomy around how I spend my time. So I wish I had realized that when I looked at my parents and other people that I looked up to, it was very linear and very static, and it's just not that way anymore. So it's a lot more like a quilt than a straight line. Zigzags.
Sorry, I just got some low power thing, but hopefully my computer will not go to sleep on me. So yeah, thank you. So Willie, what do you wish you had known?
Yes. So as I thought about this, there are four. I will try not to be verbose with this. There are 4 points that come up quickly. One is that you are much more than your major. I think we've talked about that a lot, right? But the first year or two after graduating, the major that you actually had will matter more. People will ask you about it more. But when you get to, especially when where we are 10 plus years out of school, really what will serve you, like that's my Emory degree on the wall, is Emory is your association with the university, and number 2 are your connections and the people that you have met. So the CEO of my company is one of my friends. She is also my boss. She is also my Emory classmate. So she spun out this company, Celino, out when I was living in South Korea. She started her MA PhD in laser physics at Harvard. We've stayed in touch forever and would bounce ideas off of each other. And we also always talked about working together in some capacity. And so then she called me last fall and said, hey, here are some opportunities. I'd love to create a role for you. And we did it. So I think, the people that you see around you in this room and elsewhere through the Emory community, that matters a lot. Number 3 is don't be afraid to get a no. I like to joke that I spent loads of time at Emory asking people for all sorts of things. All the time, like, oh, I would like funding for this. I'd like to go study abroad, and I'd like a grant for that. I'd like to do this thing over here. And I think because I was generally pretty unafraid to say no, I got a lot of yeses for a lot of really interesting opportunities. So I would just encourage you to do that, as whether during your time at Emory or also afterwards. And then last is, I think for people like Rebecca and me, you want to always have that perfect idea. You want to have your plan. I want my perfect job lined up. It's going to be great, right? I've got a whole plan. And I did for years, literally since I was 13. I thought that I was going to be an attorney. I had a 30-second plan, quote, in high school that I would say to everyone, this is what I'm going to do. In college, I was president of the Pre-Law Society. I interned in a law for all of that stuff. And then when I got to Korea and spent a few years there, I changed my mind. But I'm really happy that I changed my mind. And I think I chose what is the right path for me then. But my point is that I didn't know what was going to happen 3 steps in the future, right? When I got ready to leave Korea, at that point, Dr. Wakefield, you may remember a number of years ago, I emailed you and said, hey, I'm interested in the Foreign Service. I passed the exam. They're looking for recommenders and all these things. So I wanted to be a diplomat at that time. I was going through the process. And then here comes life giving you lemons. The US government shut down. And so they stopped hiring for the Foreign Service. Yet I had ended my work contract in Korea. So I didn't have a visa. So I couldn't stay in the country any longer and had to come back to the US with no job, which is how I landed in DC. Did I plan any of that? Absolutely not, because Willie likes security, and Willie would never have opted to, not to move back and not have a job. But I just figured out what the next step was. I said, I'm interested in DC. I'm interested in international affairs and other things. So I went there and I made it work. And I figured it out, not knowing what was going to be 3 or 4 steps down the road. I was just like, this is my next thing. My next thing is DC. And I'm going to get there and figure it out. And then I got another step later. And then I got another step later. So the point there is just understand that your story will change as time goes on. And it's okay. And it's good. And it's healthy. And it's natural for that to happen.
Cool. Well said. I'm getting messages. My internet is unstable. There's a little rain coming through. So if I break up, I apologize for that. But I think it'd be a good point to open it up to questions from others. Seeing my friends here, Jacqueline, Davia, Coco Chu is there, and Erik. Do you want to kick things off, Erik? What are your thoughts about all this? Questions. You've been searching for intellectual community.
Sure. You can hear me, right?
Yes, we can hear you.
So it's still really early in my education, right? I'm still first year. But one of the things that you guys have talked about it, but one of the things that I still have difficulty wrapping my head around is like embracing the non-linearity of your career after. So when I so right now I'm majoring in, applied math, right? And part of my rationale is like, I can graduate, do graduate if I want to, and then get a job, make money, and then whatever I want to learn, I can use my spare time, basically to minimize the amount of time I need to spend studying stuff relevant to my degree, so that I can spend that time studying whatever else I want. Like taking courses from disciplines that are unrelated to my major, right? So it's kind of a mindset of, I'm just going to do the minimum so that I can, maybe it's like make money, right? So I'll just do the minimum that I need to make money. And then all this other time I can buy books and read books, even if they're, textbooks, right? Technical works, right? It doesn't really matter because I have this extra time. So what's the value of spending that time to do it while you're an undergrad, rather than just taking a straightforward path and then trying to push time to the side? So it's like separating it from your career, I guess.
Great question, Erik.
Yeah, I'll jump in.
Erik's a first-year student, so yeah, thank you, Erik.
I'll jump first. So thank you, Erik, for that question. I appreciate you for sharing those thoughts. My thought is that if I hear you correctly, I think you are kind of compartmentalizing job as making money versus interests and things that you want to learn. I would encourage you to consider them to be one and not to be just two distinct pieces, because you can do both, and you have a right to do both. And I think, if you want to stay in applied math, or if you want to do something different, that the answer to that question is up to you. And the answer doesn't necessarily matter. But really what's important is, let me use a story. So I have a lot of friends who were in the business school. I was not in the business school, but I cross-enrolled at the business school first semester, and I was president of the business fraternity. So everybody thought I was in the business school, but I wasn't. So lots of my friends were in the B school, and quite a few of them went into, finance and accounting and some of these things, because specifically they're like, oh, I want to do this, I want to make money, et cetera, et cetera. And generally, almost all of them, with like 3 exceptions, probably were fairly miserable within 1 to 2 years of graduating. And almost all of them got out of investment banking and some of the other things that they've done. And I heard you articulate not wanting to make money for the sake of making money, right? But wanting to do it for, let me kind of do the minimum here so I can pursue other things. I would encourage you to just maybe even mind map or kind of think through, what is it that I would enjoy doing? Because you may find that you can make a comfortable living doing that and be able to have both of those circles overlap, rather than doing something that you don't really like for your career. Because I will say, you will over your life spend a lot of time working. You will spend a lot of time working, and doing something that you don't want to do is an exceedingly unpleasant way to spend many, dozens of hours a week. So my thought there would just be, see where those 2 circles overlap and where your interests and how you can make money. They don't have to be different. And maybe they are. Maybe it's, you want to go and be something starving artist, or you want to work in sustainable development where perhaps there isn't tons of financial return there. But if it's really fulfilling and rewarding for you, then you won't have to look elsewhere to find some of that meaning and some of that involvement.
Great.
I have so many thoughts on this too, to add, Willie. That was all very aligned with how I think about this. I mean, I'm very influenced because my husband teaches at UC Berkeley in the business school. So he's teaching undergrads, and I can't count how many times he has office hours with this exact question coming up. I think one person I would recommend you look at, just to kind of reinforce what Willie has talked about, is Laurie Santos. She teaches at Yale. She teaches a course on happiness, which is apparently like the most, or one of the most popular courses in the history. I think she's Yale, maybe it's Harvard, but it's Laurie Santos. And what her research shows is that above a certain threshold of salary, your happiness doesn't go up. Like we think money leads to happiness, but actually if you make above a certain amount, I don't remember that amount off the top of my head.
75,000, I know that study.
Okay, there you go. It doesn't actually influence. So I think that it's sort of this pressure that a lot of people, especially when you're kind of heading out of college, going into your career, you will have so much time to think about the role of money. I mean, now we have a 1-year-old, like the whole context of money has a whole different implication because we're caring for another little human. And there's plenty of time to reach that point. I think I got this advice from a mentor of mine that your 20s, like the decade from when you're 21 and when you graduate until you're 30, should be about exploring, really like finding the things in your career that give you a purpose, that help you, that challenge you, that push you into places that allow you to learn, like Willie going to South Korea, my time in Sweden, like things that really, whether it's international or not, that really doesn't matter, as long as it's something that challenges you and has you really think about your role in the world and the skills you have, the ability you have to be a change maker. And then down the line, you can think about all the, I'm not saying go out and sacrifice a salary. I'm saying make enough that you can live and be fulfilled. But I can't tell you how many executive directors, CEOs, that I coach who come to me burned out and not clear about what they've done the last decade, confused about where they spent their time because they were pursuing something that was more for the salary than it was for the purpose. So I can't impress on that point more, just that the importance of finding something that gives you purpose and fulfillment and finding ways to allow that to meet your financial goals as well.
Yeah, great answers. Yeah. So I would love to hear from everyone on this call if you have questions. So Davia, Jacqueline, Coco, Brandon, I see you there too. But at this point, I'll introduce, there was one pre-submitted question. And for me, this is kind of interesting because the person who submitted it, his name is David Culp. He was the only other person I knew at Emory who, as an undergraduate, was wearing a suit coat on almost every day, just like Willie Reeves did, right? So, Willie, that gives you some indication. If you've never met David Culp, you should someday.
He sounds excellent. I like him.
Yeah,
he's top
exactly.
notch.
He probably is going to watch the recording of this. He says, Mr. Reeves, in what ways does your IDS degree influence the way in which you think about machine learning in healthcare?
Ooh.
David himself is in healthcare. I'll just reveal that.
Okay.
So, David, if you're watching the recording, keep going.
All right. Juicy question. All right. How does IDS influence? So I think in a couple of different ways. My company and what we're doing is really interesting. And just at a high level, in creating new differentiated stem cells, basically, normally you would have a scientist sitting at the bench and they're kind of scraping away at cells saying, oh, these cells look good. They're going to become good stem cells. That's great. These cells look unhealthy. So we are training machine learning algorithms to be able to do that process and make those predictions and make those determinations so that then we can create stem cells at scale at like a very high level. So when I think about how interdisciplinarity works with our work, I think about what I do every day and what my teams do every day. So we have a data and machine learning team. It's a lot of software programmers. We have a stem cell biology team that has people with, PhDs in molecular biology, et cetera. We've got an automation and engineering team. They're hardware people. They build insane things, micro miniaturized things that are super, super difficult. We have all of these different people, but the machine learning piece is actually quite integral to what we do. And it's one thing that makes our company very differentiated in the market. But the machine learning only works because all of the rest of the pieces are at play. The machine learning only works because the algorithm is learning from the images from the cells that our biology team is generating. The ML only works because the product team is then taking a lot of these learnings and then building them into our cell products and adding additional levels of automation. So starting very manual, and then version 2, a little more automation, version 3, a little more automation. So I think it's funny because ML in itself, people think, software engineering, and it's very technical and in some senses unidimensional. It's not, but it works in my company precisely because all of those intersections and all of those collisions of these very, very different fields allow the machine learning part to work. So I appreciate and even like the psychology behind machine learning and the way that we think and the way that we're saying, okay, this is what we were saying as scientists. This is what the scientists are thinking in the bench. Now, how do we translate that into algorithms and applications? So I see loads of intersections actually, and I think interdisciplinarity bears really, really nicely on the work that, for example, my company is doing on machine learning.
Excellent. A great answer right off the top of your head. I think Erik Shu has a follow-up question here.
Yeah, so I'd like to, it makes the question a little more complex, but like I consider myself to be somebody that if I took like a random number generator and assigned it to all different majors in college and I rolled one, I could be happy probably studying anything. So it's not necessarily that I don't like applied math, I'm doing it for my career, but I also do love math. But for, at least in my current state of mind, I think it's one of the most direct ways to translate it to a career. So what I'm balancing is kind of how I can, go into or study at some point all the things that I have like an interest in, while at the same time maintaining like a relatively steady course towards career. So it's not that I'm, kind of doing this, I'm not entirely compartmentalizing them, but it's kind of difficult for me to figure out where to mix things in, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that. But was there a question there, Erik?
Yeah, it's how did I guess more explicitly, like how did you go about figuring out what components of whatever you enjoyed most? How did they end up fitting together? And like, do you kind of do you have a even though it's like we said, the career path is not linear, right? But is it that you have faith that like the non-linearity will bring you somewhere that you find you'll truly enjoy?
Rebecca, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, it was a little hard to hear, but let me know, cut me off if this isn't answering your question, Erik. But I think the way that the nonlinear career works is when you actually have a certain mindset going through it. And that mindset is one of learning and curiosity and consistently, self-inquiry, right? Like always questioning, always staying curious. So I think it's more about actually, someone who has a nonlinear career that just kind of hops from thing to thing and isn't mindful of that hopping. I don't know if that's as rewarding as it is when you making those choices that you're consistently throughout having that mindset of what am I learning, right? What's different about this experience? What can I apply from my past experience to what I'm doing now? Like actually building the muscle for that mindset, I think is far more important than spending too much time deciding. I mean, I don't think one should just pick a random job experience that comes mindlessly, but I do think you can make and learn a lot from any experience that comes your way if you have that mindset and you have some autonomy in the role to actually hold that curiosity and actually learn from it. So I think that that's the most important thing about actually pursuing, at least on the career side. I don't know if that applies directly to how you put your major together, but I certainly think as you start to get out into the workforce, having, building the muscle for that kind of mindset is so critical for really getting value out of being an interdisciplinary person out in the world outside of college.
Great. Okay. We're kind of in, everybody take a little break here. All intense questions, great answers. Hoping to open this up. Davia, Jacqueline, Coco, Brandon, any questions?
Yeah, I can go next. I had a question more about, I think we've touched on it a lot, but I'm a junior and I'm also an interdisciplinary studies major. And the point that you said, Willie, about someone saying like that IDS was just short for like, I don't study major, really like resonated with me. And I think like in the ILA, we've had a lot of conversations about like the legitimacy of the IDS major. And so I guess I'm wondering like, because like in my head, like I know it's so legitimate and I love it and I wouldn't have made any other decision. But I'm wondering like, once you graduated college or like out in the workforce, you said your major was very relevant in the first like 3 or 4 years. So like, how did you go about like navigating how to explain what you had done in college, like to professionals, and like, I guess, how was it perceived?
Yes, thank you for that question, Davia. I spent a lot of time thinking about this, especially in those first couple of years. So I'll say a few things. One is what I often ended up doing was explaining to people, it was less about the title and it was less about interdisciplinary studies and citing culture. It was more about what I learned out of it. So sometimes, depending on the context of the conversation, I would talk about my honors thesis and all of the research that I did in these different areas and historical memory. And as Dr. Wakefield was mentioning, talking about Spain, there were all of these different pieces. There was even parts of psychology and the human ego that were in there. So depending on the conversation, I might talk about that. In other contexts, I would say, I had studied interdisciplinary studies, and then I would name off my focus areas. I would say I did a lot of study in philosophy, political science, business, law, and I would kind of name off these few areas and then say the central area that I was exploring was international human rights. That's interesting to me because of XYZ. One thing that's a human right is education, which is why I spent 2 years teaching in South Korea. Having access to the rights of life and not having a super suppressive government is another human right, which is why I co-founded an NGO for North Korean refugees. Now, fast forwarding into the biotech space for the last 8 years or so, it's really looking at health as a human right and how can we expand access. Like cell therapies are really great and they have tons of potential to not only treat, but also potentially reverse and cure disease. However, cell therapies that are currently on the market only work sometimes for a specific demographic. It tends to be people of European descent and not be particularly effective for people of other backgrounds. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we want to do as we work toward building a really diverse and equitable company is we're thinking about the patient populations that we serve, and health is a human right, that no matter what someone's genetic background, no matter what their heritage or their lineage is, we want those therapies to be able to be accessible to them. So I just said a lot of words. I think in the center of that is, as you're thinking through what you want to explain to people, maybe think about it less about what was my degree or kind of, what's the title of the thing on the wall, and perhaps consider more, how does what I studied tie into what I'm doing now or into what I'm interested in doing for my next step? Because the international human rights piece for me, it still guides me and it still really guides what I'm interested in. It has changed forms. It has been education. It has been refugee rights. It has been anti-human trafficking NGO. It has been all of these things. But really, that core focus of human rights is still what I'm interested in. I just do it through different lenses. And every couple of years, I have changed my lenses and put a new set of them on.
One thing, Davia, thank you for that question. I just add quickly to that. I think Willie's response was so spot on. I at least haven't found that to be complicating in my career. I have worked for organizations that hold that even the Third Plateau where I work now, we call ourselves a multidisciplinary social impact strategy firm, right? Like I have been drawn to organizations that actually my background in the ILA or IDS major is actually what they are drawn to, right? Like when I worked at Ashoka, we worked to identify social entrepreneurs from all different fields of work, from human rights to public health to education. And so my orientation of how do all these things fit together actually allowed me to understand the organization better. And I would say the same thing goes now when I'm working with all different kinds of clients. One of my coaching clients is the leader of the largest Indigenous rights movement in the US, all the way to like a head of a big think tank in San Francisco. I use that constant ability to see different perspectives so much in that. So I think it's more about how can you find positions and organizations that you're drawn to work for that actually honor that orientation that you have to the world. And I think if you're in love with your major and feel that way, you're going to find organizations just like we have that really speak to that. The last thing I'll say is if I were to graduate now, and we haven't even talked about COVID and the pandemic, but thinking about the world we're in now and the world you've lived through as a student in all of this, it's a very different time. I think the problems in the world are so much more complex than they were 2 years ago this week, right? And I think having the ability to see across disciplines is more important now in this world than it ever has been. So I would also say, like, as Willie talked about the different lenses to look at your educational path, I think the ability to see across disciplines now, and actually spending some time thinking about how is the world different now? How do you see the world different? And how can you look at that experience you've had in the IDS major based on the world we're now in differently, and actually using that to communicate the reason you chose this educational path.
Yeah, and if I can add further to that, sorry, Dr. Wakefield, Rebecca and I just vibe off each other so well.
We've never met each other, but now I feel like
I know, it's so funny. And this also partially is to address something that Erik said a few moments ago. So I think there is, Erik, you asked also a question around, I want to get the most out of what I'm studying. I want to balance how to study all the things I want while having this kind of steady course load. So I would also keep in mind too, right? You have an amazing opportunity at Emory in the undergraduate program in the ILA. At the same time, your education doesn't end when you graduate, right? So and that will happen in many different ways. You might decide to go to grad school later, and maybe you don't. Or, I decided, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, I think, to do a disruptive strategy program with Harvard Business School. It was online and it was amazing and tremendously helpful. I was able to immediately put it into practice. I did an entrepreneurship program with the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton Business School. Like, there's all of these different things that you can also do later that don't have to be a degree, that don't have to be 2 and 3 and 4, 5+ years, but that can also add plenty of value, in addition to the just tremendous knowledge that you'll get as you're working, as you're learning, whether that's in Sweden or South Korea or in San Francisco or right back in Atlanta, right? So I think there's also sometimes this tension of how do I maximize everything? And I was a maximizer. I am still kind of a maximizer, admittedly. I'm recovering. And I think that's okay, but at the same time, I think it's worthwhile to consider, what does the entire thread of your learning look like? And how are all of the ways that you learn going to manifest? Like Rebecca mentioned earlier, doing foreign taxation and trying to figure that out. Like, one of the first times that I went to the grocery store in South Korea, disclaimer, I'm allergic to seafoods. That's like 70% of Korean cuisine. So I was allergic to like everything. I had to cook a lot while I was there. And one of the first times that I went to a grocery store, I, got groceries, blah, 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 went and got some produce, went to the checkout counter and thought I was going to check out. And the older lady that was kind of checking me out and bagging the groceries was like screaming at me in Korean very fast. And I had no idea what was going on. I was asking her in Korean, can you slow down? I'm not sure what's going on. It was this whole procedure. And I'm like, all right, let me try to meet her where she is. Is she going to call the police on me? Like, I don't know what's going on. I'm very confused. Eventually, I figure out, she walks me to the back of the store. There was a common social principle that I didn't know, which is that in Korea, you don't measure your produce at the front of the store. There is a machine in the back by the produce section that you have to measure each individual thing and print off and take a sticker and put it on your bag of potatoes. I failed to do this, however, with my bag of potatoes, carrots, and other various produce. So she was very upset about it. I used that. We figured it out, got through all the communication troubles, but I used that as a somewhat, with levity, but as an example of all of these different things that you're going to learn as time goes on. How to deal with interpersonal conflict, how to deal with cross-cultural collaboration, how to deal with cross-cultural conflict. So many pieces you will get that are outside of just strictly your classes. So while your classes are super important, and we have ones that we look back on really fondly, there's also all of this learning too that's going to happen outside the classroom, that will happen after you graduate, and that will happen beyond that. And so just remember that all of those pieces go into the story of who you are and what your career is like.
Yeah, well said. Well said. Lifelong learning in a nutshell, right? So, Jacqueline, you've been listening very carefully, I can tell by the look on your face. Any reflexes or questions you'd like to get in here?
I'm actually a senior majoring in psychology, and I'm actually graduating earlier than I expected because I don't know why I did that. And I always like I took IDS because my friend recommended me to take this class, and I always tell him like that this is what the only classes that I step out of the class every time, rethinking about my career choices and my life paths, and having really panic attacks like throughout the week because I don't know what I'm gonna do next. And I was wondering if there were ever moments in your life where you regretted doing an IDS major, or like seeing people that go to like business school around you having maybe a better interviewing skills, or having like a resume or like cover letters that are all mapped out already, and having all these technical skills where you may or may not, or I think I do, where I lack those skills a little bit more than them. For example, my networking skills, or just like overall technical skills in terms of like the workplace, where sometimes I have these moments of, oh, I wished I got these training more. And I was wondering if you ever felt that way, and if you like, how would you deal with it in your position?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question, Jacqueline. I definitely have had moments of wishing I fit into a box more than I do. And I don't know if I feel that way at this point in my career anymore, but I did especially as a senior when I was going out in the workforce. It was post 2008 recession. I graduated in 2010. So it was hard. And I noticed all of my friends finding it was so obvious where they went next. And for me, it was a lot of inquiry. It was a lot of reflection. It was a lot of, I have no idea what I need to do or what I want to do. So I guess there's some regret at that time, but it fades. Like my memory of that is very fuzzy at this point, looking back at that. And I think it's easier when you look at those friends going off and finding those jobs that are just so straight and linear. It does sound easier and it does sound appealing, but I think as I look at where I am now and what I value less the ability to fit in a box. And I value more fulfillment, day to day, feeling like I did something that had a positive impact on the world. Finding work that brings out the best. I've said this before, like brings out the best in me. Like I know what my strengths are now, and I want a job that allows me to engage those every single day. That all matters a whole lot more than the ability to fit my resume on one page and have it be kind of replicable or understandable to any given person. So I'm not saying that to say that's not an important and valid experience, because I do recall that vaguely. But I also think as you continue down your career, you'll find what your values are. Right now, the world puts on you the value of finding a good job and having these set of skills to provide in that job. And I think those values will get more clear to you as you get experience. So I don't know if I have more to say than that right now. It's a great question, though.
Yeah, I also really like that question, Jacqueline, and I appreciate you for also sharing. I think that took a lot of kind of courage and authenticity. It was a very vulnerable sort of question to ask. My first 2 years when I was in Korea, I remember distinctly like looking on LinkedIn, and my friends, many of whom again were in business school, were whatever, doing this in Bank of America, they're doing this in investment banking, and they had this very clear trajectory. They're in consulting. Oh, they got promoted to senior consultant, right? So it was a lot of, man, I'm 7,400 miles away. Like, what am I doing over here? I don't have this very clear thing that looks like it's progressing, and it doesn't look like I'm growing. And then it's funny because as time went on, so fast forward, come back, and in looking back on that time, so many things have happened that I never could have imagined that I was able to do. So yeah, I didn't go to business school. I didn't study finance. I didn't study accounting, but I became chief business officer of like a major organization at a pretty young age, right? And a lot of that happened precisely because of the intersections and precisely because I was comfortable exploring all of these different areas. And that led the company to tap me for that role. So, and to the, you mentioned kind of the idea of the resume and having the easy to follow story. It was hard. For a bit, it was hard in being able to articulate, especially because I went abroad, like that complicated things a little bit, but it was hard to articulate like what I was interested in. And I kind of shared earlier about that mosaic idea, but a particular anecdote that I still remember. So had just come back from Korea. I was doing contract work in DC for the Biotech Trade Association, and they were considering bringing me on full time for a role. So, I have this resume with different countries and languages and whatever, and it looks very confusing and sounds like something that's very hard to sell. So as I was going through the negotiation process for this role, the vice president at the time said, "Hey, the resume that you sent to the HR department, I didn't see all your tech consulting stuff that you did when you ran your own shop on there." And I said, "Well, Peter, I didn't think that was super relevant for bio." He's like, "No, that's absolutely relevant. You're going to be working on this technology partnerships platform. That's a software platform. All of that ties in. You should make your resume 2 pages." I was like 24. And at that moment, I just remember thinking, oh, there's more of my experience that's relevant to people that they see value in that I didn't see value in. Mm-hmm. So I think, and it took hearing that from him. And then, I really was much more comfortable having the totality of my experience. And it has caused these very interesting conversations years later when I'll meet people or recruiters or potential partners or whoever will message me on LinkedIn. And they're like, "Yeah, so I saw the countries on your resume and you've done all these different things. Like, this is super interesting. I just want to talk to you." So I say that not to say that, I'm a super interesting person. I think everyone in the IDS program creates really interesting stories, but people sometimes, it's easy to see yourself and say, this doesn't feel linear. It doesn't feel like I'm progressing. But the ways in which I progressed, they weren't linear. I skipped about 15 or 20 years of what many other folks in my company would have spent in kind of lower to mid-level management and jumped into executive management. And it happened not despite my IDS major, but because of it. It was precisely because I did all these different things and was able to look at situations. We started hosting a conference in Brazil, and I remember immediately saying, "Oh, who's printing materials in Portuguese? Who's working with the clients in Portuguese?" They were like, "What? Portuguese?" And I said, "Yeah, the official language in the country where you're doing an event. Yes." So it was very interesting, and I took over all of that and just started doing it. And it was really fun. And I got to work on all sorts of really interesting things. And then I spent more time working in Brazil later. But it was precisely because I'd had all these experiences, Argentina, teaching in South Korea, all these things that people were interested in me. That's how I got all these different opportunities. And I think, had I been linear, would I have still had opportunities? I'm sure, right? I could have gone into consulting. I could have gone to the Foreign Service. There's lots of things that I could have done that are step 1, step 2, step 3. But by the very fact that you are, that you've even have taken this IDS course with your psychology major, I think there is less of that step 1, step 2, step 3. Sometimes you're going to go from step 1 to step 10 and you don't know how, and you don't see the way to get there, but life will kind of give you that way to get there. So I think I would just say, I totally understand that feeling. I absolutely had that feeling about looking at others and their trajectory. And what's funny is that years later, some of those same people who I was envying on LinkedIn have come back to me like, "Wow, how did you do all this stuff in so much time? You've gone so much farther." So I think just be open to what opportunities that there are out there. And it's very hard, especially for people who went to schools like Emory, but try not to use everyone else around you as a meter stick.
Great answer. I mean, Jacqueline, I appreciated your question too. I mean, a couple of other ways to think about it, so you're bringing really interesting psychological insights into the works we're reading now. So that's one thing. And who knows, wherever you go in the next career, when is a sort of reference to Sophocles' Antigone or Charles Dickens' Hard Times, really going to sort of show that you've thought about this in new and different ways, right? So it's all to say life is unpredictable, but in some ways, those touch points will come back to you, I think, at unexpected moments.
Yeah, I'm also a freshman at Emory, and I'm planning on majoring in business. Wait, let me turn on my camera real quick. Sorry. Yeah, and I'm also planning on majoring in business. And I was kind of wondering whether I should care. Like, I'm interested in entering biotech, but I don't know if I should take like STEM courses or like courses related to like biology as well as just like business humanities type courses as well.
So you got
Great
two
question.
seniors here as well as two graduates to answer that question. So go ahead. Willie, you want to start?
Sure. So Brandon, I would start by asking the question, do you want to work in a lab? Do you think you want to work in a lab?
No, I was thinking more like commercial side, like more of like the finance, like operations type side of a company.
Mhm. Okay, that's helpful. I think knowing just that alone, it could be useful and provide helpful context to you to take some STEM classes, specifically things in biology. I know a lot of commercial folks that we work with do that in undergrad, or even they have some doses of that, and then they come around later and are more on the commercial and business side of things. I think it can be really helpful. I would say only take those courses if you think they are interested. If you don't, you shouldn't take them. And so when I started at Emory, I actually started in an advanced science research program called Inspire, that I'm not sure if it actually still exists anymore. But I spent lots of time, my first year and a half in particular, in labs and doing biology work and chemistry. And it's interesting. I knew that wasn't really what I wanted to do long term, but all of those, having that experience so much better helps me to contextualize and understand what the stem cell biology team at my company now is doing and how those pieces tie together. So I think my short answer is I would say less about what you should do and it's more about what do you want to do. If maybe you take one of those courses, maybe you take Intro to Biochem or something like that, or take PChem, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is the worst thing ever, I hate it. That's fine. That is a perfectly good realization, because that's a piece of data for you on what it is that you're interested in and what you like. And maybe you get in and you say, oh, this is super interesting, and you want to explore further some of those topics in the business school. And I know that the B School's curriculum has changed since I was there, but there are other kind of sub paths that you could take that I think are interesting. So I would say be guided by your interest and keep that intellectual curiosity is a main point, because ultimately to do something like, you've heard my path, none of what I did was what you should do on paper, but it worked. It's fine. You figured it out.
What do you think, Jacqueline, as a senior psychology major, just to get a few voices in here?
I was also in your position when I was a freshman. I was sure I was going to go to the business school with my roommate. I had it all planned out. But before I was applying to the business school, I actually got a lot of people telling me, if you go into the business school, you actually lose a lot of sides of critical thinking in like the College of Arts and Science, which I can't speak much because I take business school classes as well, but I spend most of my time out of business school. But I would say the classes that gave me the most insight are the ones that I least expected. And a lot of them are actually recommendations from friends as well. Like I took a computer science class for fun, which I do not know why I did that. I absolutely hated computer science going in. I still don't like it. But coming out of that course, what I found really interesting is even though I had a breakdown every day, every Friday, I think, because we had a quiz every Friday, and that was like my mom knew not to come into my room because I'd probably be cramming some script or something. But what was interesting is when people explain to me what they're doing in coding. I don't know exactly, but I can understand kind of their logic behind it. And I think that's just a tangent point in a lot of stuff. So even like I took a bunch of econ courses as an econ minor, still don't like it, but they're like the basis of health economics, which health marketing is something I'm interested in right now. So I'm still lost in my life, as you can tell, of asking questions, but I think the most interesting courses, or the courses I got the most insights, are the ones that I least expected, or even sometimes it's the connections I make in that class. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Jacqueline, just to share, I mean, I'm still trying to figure out what I'm going to do in my career too. So, but Rebecca, you were not, well, you were more in the public health side, but now how much is that still related?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have anything to offer on the biotech side, but so I was interested in public health, and I kept taking classes in Rollins and the global health major or minor. And then the nonprofit that I worked right out of college that I mentioned, the startup, that was a public health organization in Brazil. And then I just sort of, it's the part of my, I think to your point, Dr. Wakefield, everyone's always asking questions of themselves. What am I doing? Is it the right thing right now? Like, I don't think there's some destination that anyone gets to where they've figured it all out. So it's always a process. For me, the public health has been a thread through my whole story. I did get my MPH when we lived in Sweden, actually, at Karolinska Institute. But I never really, I sort of always had that as a curiosity and never decided to make it my career, sort of like the vertical that I was really interested in, even though the work I wanted to do was sort of more at the horizontal level of working across fields of work. So I think it's perfectly fine to have a vertical that you're interested in, even if it never shows up in your career, just to have that thing that you're really interested in. And now I look at COVID and everything that's gone on, and it's been really helpful to have that degree in epidemiology to lean on to try to understand everything that's gone on. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, interesting. I want to move to wrap this up. This has just been a very interesting conversation. I'm glad everyone participated. But I was thinking both, well, Jacqueline and Davia and Coco and Julian, I'm looking especially at Willie. Rebecca, I don't remember exactly what classes you took in IDS, but so Willie, I know you were there, and Professor Glazoff Corrigan was teaching with me. And you read Dickens' Hard Times, and you read Antigone by Sophocles. You read Plato. Have you ever thought about these works since that time?
You know what's so funny is that I feel like over the years I have increasingly become the sort of person who refers back to books that I read when I was an undergrad. And while 1984 isn't one that we read in one of those courses, I probably make at least 5 1984 references per week, or 5 George Orwell references, or Ray Bradbury. So it is interesting because sometimes I'll think through these sort of philosophical situations, or like my company is going through lots of scaling right now. So how do we address this? How do we address that? And sometimes in many of these stories, when you have kind of that protagonist and there's the struggle and there's the climax and what is it that they're going through, it's a similar train of thought with the way that some of our employees feel that they're experiencing things going on inside the company, which is why I appreciate people like Rebecca so much. We have also an executive coach. My executive coach is amazing, and she keeps me together. So I think that sort of work is amazing. But yeah, sometimes I actually do think back to those works, and sometimes I'll even explicitly refer people to them because it's again in those uncommon and unexpected areas where you don't anticipate something to just pop into your mind, and then all of a sudden it does. Or as I was, kind of prepping for this discussion today, I thought about the Interdisciplinarity by Joe Moran that I read toward the end of my experience in my last semester, and how it's so funny that for years I was like, oh, this is difficult to explain my interdisciplinary degree. But now, like Rebecca, my company specifically seeks that out. We call out that we are a multidisciplinary company, and we sit at the intersection of all of these fields and create something new out of them.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Which is lots of fun.
Rebecca, any literary works or books that you read as an undergraduate that you still think about?
It's funny because I think a lot of the books on my shelf I took a lot of anthropology courses. That was the department that I was in the most. I have all of the books on the shelf. I mean, we have a bookshelf, and my husband is a total minimalist. Even though he is a professor, he loves to have books either recycled onto people or listen to audiobooks. And I have pretty much the full entirety of our bookshelf with all the books from college that I still keep. So I don't know if I reference them per se, but I think just having them as part of my story and being able to, I don't know, there's something about holding on to those books that I definitely still do. So
that's cool. I missed out on getting you to read some Plato with me.
I think I missed that. I don't recall if I took a course with you.
The door is always open. You got a place to study Plato back here at Emory, whenever you'd like.